Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of CIRC 2024. Well, looks like lots of people have slept in today. We didn't have any alcohol last night for the conference dinner, just in case people, got drunk. But anyway, so we'll kick off. I know 8:30 start is pretty early for lots of people, particularly the younger ones. Yesterday we had a very busy day, and today is another busy day with lots of interesting articles and the programs for the whole day. Today we will start with a roundtable discussion. It's a very casual discussion to look at the Chinese internet after 30 years of history. So we all know this year marks the 30 years of Chinese internet. Many efforts have been made to reflect on the occasion, such as a workshop on 30 years of the internet in China in February and March, organized by Professor Guobin Yang at the University of Pennsylvania. On 21st of June, there's a roundtable on 30 years of the Chinese internet and beyond at ICA, organized by CAP. So I will be there too, and some of us will be there too to talk about 30 years of Chinese internet again. We also know that, apart from the workshop, offline and online that are organized by Guobin, and there are also other efforts which are also streamed online. You can find on YouTube on the Chinese internet of 30 years. All right. And again, when I look at the Chinese language media and the state organizations in China, they have also put up lots of shows to, celebrate the 30 years of Chinese internet. And then there's lots of talks about achievements, milestones, to look at the history in order to project the wonderful future. What we are doing today is not to repeat what all the other efforts have done. I wanted my panelists to look at their personal journey rather than reflecting the Chinese internet and its achievements in the last 30 years per se. So by looking at how you started your research on Chinese internet and what are the changes, the trajectories that you have gone through, and that would lead us through the journey to look at what are the key issues, what are the milestones, and what are the junctions and the disjunctions that have occurred along the way. So I have asked the panelists two questions. One is to reflect on their personal journey, academic journey, to look at their own Chinese internet research in their last decades. Secondly, I asked them to reflect on the current and the possible future topics and debates that would occur in this field. So people in this field, particularly younger scholars, will be able to follow through. All right, I'm going to very quickly introduce our panelists. I'm Haiqing Yu from MIT University in Melbourne. I'm one of the organizers of this conference. And then I will start with Professor Guobin Yang from Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania. As I said, he's the one who has probably been the best known scholar on Chinese internet research, but his research also goes beyond Chinese internet, of course. He has done lots of research on social movements, digital culture, global communication, and contemporary China. So he's got a lot of titles, many directorship titles. I'm not going to repeat that. You can all find out. And then after Guobin, we'll continue with another established scholar, Peng. Professor An is a professor at the Wiki School of Communication, Information, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And he, has been a very well established, scholar in the field, also, very experienced in running research centers, departments, and the academic journals as chief editors, etc. So again, another person who's lived long enough to see the history and and to be able to reflect not just on Chinese internet but also on the internet in general in Asia Pacific in particular. Then the third speaker would be Elisa Oreglia from the King's College London. She's a reader in the global digital cultures. Is it a reader which is like Associate professor. Again, she's those students and scholars would have all read her work on on China and the global South, particularly the circulation, adoption, and the use of digital technologies in this area. So again, she's one of those scholars whose research is not just confined to Chinese internet or digital cultures, but also look at China as global China and the China in the world. The fourth will follow by Kara. Kara Wallace is Associate Professor in Media Communication at University of Michigan. She's another one, very disciplinary scholar, as we all do, but her work spans the field of mobile social media, China studies, feminism, and the critical studies of technology. Then we'll go to Peter. Again, it's another US-based scholar from Texas A&M University. Like Professor Peng Hua, Peter also have played an instrumental role in setting up CERC from day one. So Peter is basically has nurtured the baby, the CERC, to today. He's a law professor of comparative law, professor of law and communication, director of the Center for Law and Intellectual Property at his university. And then last but not least, we have Professor Florian Schneider from Leiden University. As you can see, we have star power here. And Florian is the professor of modern China research at Leiden University, academic director of Leiden Asia Institute. And he is also the director, managing editor of the academic journal Asiascape Digital Asia. Again, by being managing director of the journal, again, it gives you a much wider perspective on internet in China or Chinese internet. So I'm looking forward to them sharing their views to reflect not just on their own research journey in the research field of what we call Chinese internet research, but also to reflect on the bigger field. Thank you, Professor Guobin Yang.
It works. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Haiqing, for your very kind introduction and for having me on this panel. So to talk about really our personal intellectual journeys in this field is really, I thought, in a way of talking about, it's a shared journey that a lot of us in this room even, and many who are not in this room, have been on this journey together from the very beginning, I think. The way I sort of started working on the internet was quite accidental. I was finishing up my sociology dissertation on the Red Guard movement in the late 1990s and just accidentally hit upon websites. At that time, internet was really just taking off in China. Websites set up by former Red Guards and sent on use, and those attracted my attention. So after I finished my Red Guard dissertation, for a time I didn't know what to do, right? And I started just surfing the web. And that's the language at the time, surfing the web, and then got really interested and realized that this could be something important in the future. And I started doing, that's my sort of post-dissertation research project. And when I still remember when I began to submit to journals, articles to journals, I'll always get questions from reviewers. The internet? Does the internet matter? Right now it's like 30 years ago, we are in a totally different world. So I was trained as a sociologist, and I also thought of myself, before sociology, I studied literary theory, literature. So my work is very much interdisciplinary, and throughout the years, I think that's what I've been trying to do. I'm very interested in how the internet, digital media is embedded in social life, social, political, cultural life, as well as the kind of potential and actual disembedding effects it might have in terms of impact on various aspects of society. So most recent book published 2 years ago, the Wuhan lockdown, even though it seems to be about the Wuhan lockdown. I thought of think of the book as in a way a kind of a sequel to the book on the internet activism, which came out in 2009. So this book was 2022, because the internet was everywhere in 2020. It's an important part of the pandemic experiences, not just in China, but also worldwide. And throughout the book, really, it's everywhere as well. So in a way, it's a revisiting some of the arguments in the earlier book in a different context. One big difference, I would say, is that in the earlier book, I tried very hard to theorize how do I analyze the internet, because at that time I still remember it was very difficult to situate my analysis against other sort of works in the field, because it was an emerging field, and I felt that there was I wasn't quite sure of a kind of theoretical grounding of my work, and therefore I spent a lot of time trying to figure out concepts and theories. By the time I was working on the Wuhan lockdown book, I wasn't as much concerned about the theoretical literature. Also because I felt that writing the book in the middle of the lockdown, maybe theorizing can take a secondary place to telling the stories of the people. I wanted to document people's experiences. So after finishing the book, since then, I've been still doing work related to that book. This is my sort of current projects. In the sense that I'm really thinking very hard about how to do research post-pandemic. Because at the time when I was writing the book, I was thinking, this is going to change the world, and it has to change the way we do research, and has to change the way we understand media and the internet. And I'm trying to figure out some of the theoretical issues which I didn't go into in the book. And the theoretical issue for me is mainly about theorizing as opposed to storytelling in our own research. And I'm more and more sort of, I think, attracted to the idea of storytelling as a form of theoretical practice and even political practice. And this is personal for many of us, because we understand from our experiences during the pandemic, especially I think in the US, when the pandemic sort of happened at the same time as anti-Asian, anti-Chinese, all kind of hate and racism was also on the rise. And there was debates among so-called China watchers, China scholars in the US about, where does this come from, right? What's the role of the intellectuals and China researchers in this process? Does our own research, in some ways, actually, could be responsible for part of, but essentially, have we been producing research that eventually comes back to us, that we have been feeding that kind of discourse that eventually also contributes to the anti-Asian, anti-Chinese discourse? That's something I've been thinking very hard about. And at the same time, I was also reading, literature outside of the field about kind of new turns in social cultural critique. How do we approach critique? And there is the Haiqing, stop me if I go beyond time. How many minutes do I still have?
I'll decide. You go ahead.
Okay. Just to make a long story short, there is a critique in the cultural studies field and literary theory, particularly about how the whole tradition of social critique, the whole tradition of cultural literary critique, is a hermeneutics of suspicion, where you take our object of study as criminal suspect. And this is particularly strong in the Cold War period, but it's still here at the present is still what we are practicing, intentionally or not intentionally. We are treating what we study. Suppose we are studying the internet, and China is the internet. China is the criminal suspect. That's the problem. That there's nothing good we can say about the kind of everyday practices of ordinary people in their everyday life. Eventually, well, actually, academic work can be a lot more sophisticated and nuanced than what we are represented in the mass media. Because when it comes to the mass media representation of the Chinese internet, right, it all comes down to a couple of buzzwords, which are all bad. And that kind of discourse eventually feeds into that kind of general discourse, general discursive atmosphere. So my reflection really is both for my intellectual journey and for what I'm doing now and what I want to do in the future is how can we do research in ways that will not contribute to that kind of discourse, which eventually will harm ourselves and our own communities. So that's why earlier this year, the Chinese Journal of Sociology, they would like me to do a special issue on digital China, because sociology journal, they don't have a lot of work articles on the internet media. So I proposed a special theme issue called Toward a Hopeful Sociology of Digital China. So that's the kind of direction that I'm working on. But obviously, it's not attracting a huge lot of attention because I haven't received a lot of submissions. And I would encourage you, I would invite you all to think about it if you're interested. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haiqing. That's much better put than I did. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. So it will be quite different from Guobin. I can't do what Guobin has just done, right? To give a conceptual thing like, wow, yeah, maybe that's true. Okay. So I feel that I'm the most ignorant of the whole group of people here about Chinese internet research, because I don't do Chinese. I can't read Chinese, although I'm studied school and I failed. I was telling you, I failed it at a middle school. And so I'm giving a perspective from being the editor of the journal, the Asian Journal of Communication. So my question is, what is good research? What is good Chinese internet research? And I think that here we come up against a problem. Okay, so I mean, I'm being slightly provocative, I suppose, even though it's like 9 o'clock in the morning. I think the first thing is that it's a stereotype, I know. The Chinese are good at mathematics and Kung Fu, but not good at conceptual thinking. China's are more pragmatic. So I just read this, saw this 60 Minutes interview, and they said China has 60 countries for which is the leading trading partner. And the reason China is good at development is the R&D part. It's the D part of the R&D. So it's good at development, not so good at fundamental research, because Chinese are much more pragmatic. And I think looking back, because Singapore is predominantly ethnic Chinese, Singapore is pragmatic. We don't really believe in theory. So although I know there are PhDs in the cabinet and all, but they'll take whatever works. So I think that's one kind of view of this. In contrast, the Americans, okay, it's again a broad sweep, tend to believe that whatever works in America can work for the whole world, no? But in China, it's like, what works in China? No, first you must read Chinese. Then you can understand China, then maybe you can do whatever you do. So the view isn't of okay, the Messiah complex isn't a good term, but Messiah complex, right? That will save the world. The American method will save the world. And I see some of that in my American colleagues who think that the American method of doing this thing is the best thing, and the Singapore method is no. You guys know. So the problem is that theory is supposed to work across the world. The theory is across the world, but the Chinese view, therefore, is that no, there are exceptions, right? So free speech is good across the world, but now we are seeing this stress of free speech, right? When I say this, people think from Singapore, obviously you say that free speech doesn't work, but look at what speech is done to America, right? The answer to bad speech is more speech, but that's not how it's working in a social media space. So you need to rethink this theory. But because it's been there for so long, I think it's a big issue there, and I think it needs to be worked out. But I think the first point that I have is that the theoretical and conceptual part. So as editor of the journal, I reject many articles simply because they lack theory. right? It does. So for a good academic journal, you have to focus on theory. But if you don't focus on theory, you just focus on, let's say, network analysis. You collect a bunch of data, do network analysis. Sorry, that's out, because there's no theory, then it's out. So I think the one major issue is the theoretical conceptual part. The second one is the word Chinese in title, right? The Chinese Internet Research suggests it's a regional conference, regional issues, not global in considerations. So again, that kind of works against being published in good leading journals. In contrast, again here, you can see that if a study is done in a Midwest college, right, even of second-year students in psychology, that research has global implications, right? Whatever setting is done, okay, there's global impact. But if it's done, so I have one research that was done in 3 colleges, not just one college, 3 colleges, 1,200 students or more, I forgot the number now, of students in India. Well, that paper got rejected so many journals that my co-author and I, at first I wasn't a co-author, but this person was co-author, helping him to polish and all that. It was revised, okay, the most revised paper in my life, and I think beats anybody's here, right? 66 times. Meaning that, of course, internally, every time we revise, we would like change, okay, that's one version, and I, after about 20 revisions, he said, okay, I think I should include this as author. And I didn't ask, he just, this person invited me in. And finally it got into a journal published in India. Okay, reasonably good journal, but the feeling was that, I think, okay, the feeling was that it's not applicable to the rest of the world because it's done in India. So I think the similar issue of this is done in China, is it applicable across the world or not? And what I'm trying to say is criminal, but I'm also feeling that it's not, I don't think it's racism, it's generally believe that it's different, maybe the quality isn't there, whatever. But like I said, this person did everything, right? Back translation, everything like works, right? Okay, so then the question now is, what can be done, right? What is significant research? I think that although, okay, so I said earlier that we don't accept journals, the articles that are not conceptual or theoretical. I do make exception if some interesting finding, you know what I mean, right? So something interesting that people talk about, right? Then okay, we'll accept that. So I think that even in this space, we can publish works at international level, right? And the reason for publishing at a high international level is that these journals are better read, better cited, right? So you want your work out there, then you got to aim for a good journal. So I think the first one is, of course, the current rivalry between the US and China. And I think that we all, and I mean all in this room, have a role to play in making the world, okay, pardon me for saying this, but a world a better place, right? Less tension, a bit more peace than war. So my little contribution in this space is the Internet Governance Forum. Also, working from Internet Governance, and I felt that the report that came out made for a little better peace in the world. Yeah, because of tension. I don't know if you guys recall about who owns IP space, right? And to give an idea, if US goes to China goes to war with China, can US cut off China from the internet or not? Because .cn is internet space. The server is in Marina Del Rey in Los Angeles. Can the US cut it off? And it happened to Iraq, where it wasn't that the machine wasn't turned on, it wasn't turned off by the US, it wasn't turned on by the Iraqis. Actually not Iraqi, but they were based in Texas, right? So an answer is, we can't do that. So it was agreed, an international norm. Go to war. You don't cut off Russia, don't cut off the RU because there's a war in Ukraine. All kinds of sanctions, but the internet remains. So a little bit of peace there. So I'm thinking that by making a little better understanding, perhaps can contribute to a little better world there. The second one is that there are interesting trends in China that people should know. So I was in a hotel in Shanghai, and it's an interesting thing. Okay, so like in this hotel I have, there's a USB-B port, right? But the one in China had USB-C as well, right? So you don't need to carry your charger, right? So that's a plus. But there was an interesting box that played music. And you could play some free music, but I couldn't sort of read and translate. I just couldn't get the work properly. I'm trying to use the Bluetooth, but I can't use the Bluetooth. But you could stream music from it, And if you wanted your own music, you had to pay for it. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah, it's kind of interesting that, hey, maybe the possible revenue for hotels, right? And you're seeing this in China, like, hey, wow, this guy's really thinking ahead, no? It's a new hotel, like, so interesting models. So I'm thinking there must be interesting models out there in China that the West have not considered. And I'm not seeing this anywhere in hotels, right? Maybe Peter, you've seen some, but where you have a streaming box and charge you for the music you want to talk. So I think there are interesting things that are worth looking at from Chinese perspective, and I think interesting findings as well. So on that note, I'm going to leave this. So next speaker. Okay.
All right. Thank you for putting together the panel, Haiqing. When you told us which question we should think about, I found myself organizing my thoughts like a Chinese policy document. So there are 2 headings, each has 3 subheadings, and each subheading has 4 points. So it might be a while. But regarding the first heading, own trajectory in studying Chinese internet. So my trajectory in general has been looking at the micro and then zooming out to the macro and then going back in. So in other words, I started looking at digital China rather than internet in China by not looking at the digital at all, nor the internet. What really looked interesting to me was I was living in Beijing at the time, and I was seeing migrant workers saving up to 6 months' salary to buy mobile phones. And that completely puzzled me because I always hated mobile phones. I just couldn't imagine why people would spend so much money to get a mobile phone. And so my interest was really in their daily lives, in what justified such an investment, such a commitment. How did the phone fit into their daily life? And so that project then led me, from looking at migrant workers to looking at mobile phones in the countryside. So at the very minute level of daily life, how do people who were living in the villages were integrating mobile phones in their daily life, how they were appropriating them, how they were repurposing them, what kind of hidden uses there were. But always looking at the practice rather than the device. And I think that as it's common for people taking an ethnographic approach, after a while, you become curious about the macro forces. So you go from agency to structure and start wondering. It's like, well, yes, the reason why people in this faraway village can even think of using the internet is because there is an infrastructure that has reached the countryside. How did it get here? And so that's when I started getting more interested in the political economy of digital technologies in China. And then later on outside of China. And again, in this case, I started from the macro level. So what I was seeing when I started doing a bit of work in Southeast Asia was the Chinese infrastructure bleeding across borders. So I was doing a project unrelated in Myanmar, and in northern Myanmar, at the borders with Yunnan, people were part of the Chinese internet because there was no infrastructure coming from the local government, but there was infrastructure coming from China. So the towers didn't stop at the border. You could get Chinese mobile phone, and then that meant that people were kind of caught into the Chinese internet. So they used the mobile renminbi for payments as a currency, both on mobile phones and in daily life, etc. And so from there, I kind of started looking back again at the micro practices, which led me to my current project, which is looking at the expansion of Chinese tech companies in bordering countries. And I'm looking specifically at Kazakhstan, Myanmar, and Cambodia, bordering, relatively speaking, with Cambodia. And the broader context is the digital Silk Road. So, the part of the Belt and Road Initiative that looks at digital technologies. But I was curious again, what does it look like from the ground up? So what does it mean for people that, in Cambodia and Myanmar and Kazakhstan, that there is all this Chinese tech? And one of the interesting things is that, we think, maybe more in theoretical terms about, the American companies, Chinese companies, geopolitics, etc. And I was doing a guest lecture in Phnom Penh, and I asked students, okay, which country do you think Facebook is from? And I was very surprised because about half the classroom did not have any idea. So they said, well, it's English, it's American, Canadian. And so I went through the list. So where is Google from? Where is Huawei from? And it's like, well, why should we care? It's like it's there, we're using it. And so that really gave me a different perspective on the geopolitics of digital technologies. In terms of the second point, what are the challenges and areas for research going forward? I think that it's useful to keep a longer term view. So I remember talking with Kara, who will pick up on some of the themes that I discussed. Years ago, we were moaning about the fact that, you get to grips with the QQ and then everybody has moved to WeChat. You understand how Renren works and then Renren disappears. But then looking back at it, some of the underlying trends are still there, some of the underlying attitudes, daily life, because again, it's about people's practices on a daily basis. And so that's always a useful thing to keep in mind when you go through the latest trends and developments of the technology. The second area, well, then I see a couple of challenges. One is that I don't see a lot of work on the Chinese countryside still. So I went to my villages more than 10 years ago, and I really thought that would be the beginning of a lot of people going and see how things were going in the countryside. And even though there's been a lot of interest towards Taobao villages, I think that there's still a big gap in looking at what is actually going on in villages in terms of daily life, not in terms of big development, big live streaming or whatever is the latest technology. Just what is happening in terms of daily life. The other thing that I find challenging, it's something that I need to really be aware of, is find the right balance between Chinese exceptionalism and Chinese ordinary behaviors or situations, etc. So it's it's easy to say it's different in China, and sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And so it's and I think that looking at China in other countries, it's interesting exactly to see what are the behaviors that are common. So for me, learning about the digital divide in rural villages among semi-literate people in rural villages in China has been a very helpful lesson to see the digital divide from a different perspective when then I went to Myanmar and now to Cambodia. Finally, I think that when we study the digital, the internet, etc., we're looking at very complex social technical systems. And by social, I mean society, the economy, politics, etc. By technical, I mean the hardware, the software, the technology. And I think that as a community, we've done a very good job with a focus on the social. But sometimes the focus on the technical can be sharpened. So if we talk about, for example, is TikTok American, a global company or a Chinese company? There are different ways to look at that. So there's TikTok as a global company, TikTok has localized practices, TikTok as a company that is invested by international capital, but there's also code. So is the code on which TikTok runs, is that more American code, or is it more Chinese code? Is it the same as Douyin? Is it different as Douyin? And there's a lot of that going on, when you talk about algorithmic transparency. It's like, how does it work in practice? And these are very difficult questions to answer as lone researchers. So it's always useful to tackle these areas as teams. And I think that's it from me.
Hello. Morning, everybody. Thank you, Haiqing, for organizing this great conference. So let's see, I'm starting with my trajectory. I've always been interested, since I started doing research in China, on the social and cultural implications of digital technologies, and really influenced by critical cultural and feminist technologies of power and subjectivity. And so when I was first doing my research in China, it was among young rural to urban migrant women who come to Beijing, to have, they would say, they all had the same phrase, to see the world and learn some skills, right? So I noticed early on that getting a mobile phone was a huge part of that, as Elisa said, literally saving for 6 months to buy the phone. They could tell you where they were, who they were with, when they got it. And so I really wanted to look at, theoretically, I'm really, like I said, interested by critical cultural theory. And so thinking about their mobile phone as like this mobile phone assemblage. And so not just the thing, but all the other articulations that make up this assemblage, right? So it is about the tool, but also the emotional investments, the financial investments, the time investments, the practices, the discourses. And so that's really what I was trying to do in my first book. I kind of map that, the social networking part, the urban, kind of developing this hybrid rural urban identity that was attached to the phone and so on. And it's interesting if I think about, the China Internet Research Conference and development of the Chinese internet, because when I was doing my fieldwork years and years ago for my dissertation, Jack Cho was like, Kara, you should submit a paper for the graduate student paper contest. And I'm like, but I'm doing mobile phones. Like, there's nothing on the CFP that says anything about mobile communication. And so I never did submit anything. And now, of course, that wouldn't even make sense to say, I'm a mobile communication scholar, not an internet scholar, right? We would never separate that. So I think it's interesting to think about, that sort of trajectory. And when I did wrap up my fieldwork and finish my first book, by that point, the young women and other rural residents were able to access low-end smartphones and QQ and QZone, and then eventually became WeChat. And so my second project, kind of if I'm thinking of my trajectory of my work, I just finished a book that took a long time. Okay, so it's based on like 7 years of research and then writing during a pandemic. But what I wanted to do, or what I'm doing in this book, it's called Social Media and Ordinary Life. I'm thinking about the ordinary, like Yang Guobin just mentioned. I went kind of bigger and broader and looking at 4 different marginalized groups in this kind of not completely transformed China, but definitely there are different qualities or characteristics of China. Some have been intensified. I mean, we've heard a lot about like the surveillance and whatnot over the course of the last day. And so I'm kind of situating that project in what I'm calling neo-non-liberal China. It's not the most elegant term, and I'll explain more what I mean by that in the Q&A if anyone's interested, because I don't think I have time right now. But how in the midst of that, again, like marginalized groups, economically, socially, in some cases politically, like how are they trying to live their lives, fulfill their dreams, follow their passions within these constraints that are sort of set out at the both micro and macro level. And so in that book, it traverses geographic regions and different platforms and the 4 different groups. The first one is young, marginalized creatives. They've come from rural areas to pursue what they call their shenmei, like their personal aesthetics in Beijing, whether that's art or dance or what it might be. Another chapter is on domestic workers. That's like follow-up research from what I did earlier, rural China again, with micro entrepreneurs, like mostly older, people laugh in the US when I'm like, yeah, older women, they're 40. But these women who are like their late 30s, 40s, how they are engaging very minimally with technology, where there's these broad discourses about like entrepreneurship, right, and Taobao villages. And if I think about with my first project, the young women were, supposed to be these kind of metaphorical entrepreneurs of the self in the Foucauldian term. But now the discourse is literally about everyone should, innovate, be entrepreneurial, live stream, all those kinds of things, and how they sort of negotiate that terrain. And then the final chapter is on young feminist activists who are really kind of operating under the radar and how they create video productions and live streams and so on to sort of fight against misogyny and sexism. And so it is these sort of disparate groups, but the project kind of threads through it is that the theoretically angle is I'm looking at the effective and ethical dimensions of their social media use, again, within these constraints. And so for me, theory has always been really important to try to kind of ground like my analysis, like help me understand what's going on. And so in this book, I've drawn on affect theory, which can be really frustrating because it's all these different aspects of it. But I'm really influenced by feminist theorists of affect. So like Kathleen Stewart and her notion of ordinary affects, and Sarah Ahmed and looking at what emotions do as opposed to what they are, and trying to connect that to also Chinese understandings of affect, like gan, which could be thought of as affectivity in its different senses. And thinking about ethics not as something, I'm not a philosopher of like transcendental ethics at all, but this body of work called Ordinary Ethics, associated with Michael Lambeck, and how in our everyday lives all the time people are confronted with, judgments and decisions and whatnot that kind of get at this sort of ordinary aspect of ethics, that they're like immanent in the social field. And so that really kind of helped me think about, like, even though again it's diverse groups, different ages, different pursuits, but how to tie together like what they're doing via social media. And also for me, maybe it's a political project of like Elisa said, there's not that much focus on rural China still. Young creatives, feminists, activists, those are kind of hot topics academically and in the media. Domestic workers, rural residents, not so much, right? And so in kind of putting them in conversation, I'm also arguing that we should value their voices, equally. So that's kind of like where I'm at right now. My brain needs to sit back and refresh to get some new ideas to start thinking about a future project. But again, going back to one of the things that Guobin said about the paranoid reading, that Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, I think, is who you're citing. I was talking with Elisa yesterday. I'm thinking, this forthcoming book, I don't know, people might critique me as being too hopeful. And because I thought about some of my own work, even with an earlier piece I wrote on domestic workers, and I'm like, it's easy to critique and point a finger, right? But like, what am I doing to help those domestic workers besides, volunteering once a week at this NGO? And so in the book, I'm really, and this is, I guess, also what if transitioning to the kind of, future questions that Haiqing asks us to think about is, taking people at their word in the sense, I mean, in other words, like focusing on their embodied subjective experience and how they make do, right? I mean, most of the domestic workers, they present themselves very positively online. And on the one hand, we could think, oh, they're just duped by the positive energy discourse. And it's not that at all, right? They're like, no one wants to be surrounded by negative things. Like they really see it as like uplifting each other, building community, pushing back against the discursive construction of them as backwards and all that. And that's how I understand what they're doing with their, like their WeChat posts, for example. So I guess thinking forward, I also am thinking like, okay, what other theories are sort of helpful for us in this era where, there's a lot of focus, and rightly so, on big data and AI and ADM, just like this conference. And I've learned a lot, but also hoping that people will still think about like the ordinary, experience of everyday people that, of course, they have to navigate those algorithms, whether they want to or not, but often that's not necessarily what's at the forefront of their minds. And then on just a more sort of personal, individual aspect, as a non-Chinese ethnographer, in the current environment, I do wonder, like, what does the future look like for that? Like, I'm not sure I can necessarily do the same things I used to be able to do, but because of certain constraints, but time will tell. So, yeah.
So it's extra special to follow Kara because we actually overlap at Texas A&M for a few years. So my journey actually started around the time when I was starting Circ with Jack. So I think I actually will talk about that first since we are right here in the 21st Circ. And thanks for Haiqing and the folks from QUT organizing it. So Jack came over to visit my mentor, Monroe Price. Some of you might know him, who started at Cardoso and then built a program at UPenn Edinburgh. And he actually introduced me to Guobin. And so he has been very helpful with a lot of people in their career, and including myself. And Jack and I, we were just having coffee and some I think it's like snack or lunch in the cafeteria. We're talking about what we can do together. At that time, Jack is finished up his PhD at USC Edinburgh, and I was a baby academic about to go to Michigan State to build a new IP and communications law program. So we're trying to figure out what we can do. So we figure out, well, why don't we get people together as this community is starting to emerging? And luckily, we got a very strong support from USC Edinburgh to bring different people together, including flying some of the people over there. And that happens in the year of SARS. And so we actually have to get some of the speakers to quarantine for like 2 weeks before they can speak. So that was actually quite an experience, just not something we expected. But at that time, we were trying to figure out how can we get the research about Chinese internet to get to other people, right? One of the big debate at that time is talking about how the internet will influence China, but not the other way around. And those of us who are actually writing about what's going on in China, what's going on in the internet, we all know that it's a two-way street, right? It's not just how the internet is going to influence China, but also how China is going to influence the internet, right? So I think what we're trying to do in that conference is to actually get that message across, so that it's basically a two-way street. We want to know how the internet is going to influence China, but also how China is going to influence the internet. And a lot of those issues, as Carol was mentioning, is just has changed a lot. Same thing with what Elisa mentioning. So if you go back to first conference, obviously we talk quite a bit about internet regulation and censorship. We talk about migrant population trying to get a mobile phone, blogging as a new tool for people to actually communicate. There was actually we have a panel with the Chinese bloggers talking about this new exciting medium. We talk about something called Xiaolingtong, right? So if you guys remember, it was a long time ago, right? So that was basically about more than 20 years. So some of you guys are probably still either at the elementary school or before then. Things have changed a lot, but a lot of those issues are still quite similar. I think one thing is quite interesting is that if you actually follow those academic cycles, you can actually go back to now, probably in the 80s, you'll find something new about it, right? So if you actually look at what has published in the 80s, a lot of the things actually come back now, right? So you see the cycle going on, but you just have to go back 30 or 40 years ago to find the new stuff that's in there. So the second thing I would talk about is basically how law has changed, because I'm basically a law professor. So I do a lot of I focus a lot of my research on media law, intellectual property law. And when we started, is basically mostly about internet regulation, about censorship. Now it's more exciting. We have e-commerce law, we have cybersecurity law, we have their personal information protection law, and then we have some provisions within the civil code. And I'm actually very jealous of those young researchers or PhDs who can now look at a lot of different things. Even when I started, I was doing a lot of things relating to intellectual property, both about China as well as the internet. A lot of the laws we got is basically a legal transplant. It's not really about what China needs, but more about what other countries expect China to do. But now I've seen through the third revision of the copyright law in China that actually came out during the pandemic. A lot of those provisions are tailored to local conditions. That's actually very exciting in light of what's going on in China. It's no longer just a debate about whether it's piracy, whether it's counterfeiting, but there are a lot of interesting development. There are also a lot of interesting local business models that are not found in other places. So when you think of, for example, a lot of how people use motorcycles in Vietnam, or how you have a lot of people sitting on top of a train in India, right? There are a lot of actually very interesting business model in China that's just not replicated in other places, right? Whether it's coming from Tencent, coming from Alibaba, from other places, and I think those are quite interesting. So when we are looking at the law, there are a lot of new things we can look at. What I'm currently doing now is in different directions, since I also direct the IP program at my school. As my dean used to say, and he still says that these days, if you are in administration, your brain starts to rot, right? So, and the more you go into administration, the harder you can do research. I spend a lot of time looking at what's going on with respect to the IP space. And I also look at AI, which is quite important. So with respect to IP and AI, the big issue is basically whether a lot of the works generated by AI will be copyrightable, and also whether we can actually use the copyrighted works for training purposes without worrying about copyright infringement. But I also look more broadly at the race between China, EU, and the US in the AI technology, as well as machine learning and other new digital technology. I think that is actually very interesting because when we talk about that type of debate, we should look at just the distinction between US model and EU model. And now increasingly, we are bringing in China as well. Those people here have been talking about that for about the last 5 to 10 years already. But it takes a while, right, for people to actually recognize that. So when I got the new book from Anu Bradford, who wrote about Brussels effects, I was actually pretty excited. The new book is Digital Empires, where she actually talked about 3 different models, one from US, one from EU, one from China, and talk about the global influence coming from those models. And when you get other people who are not deep into Chinese research and talking about the different model coming from China, I think that's very exciting. A few years ago, when Julie Cohen published her book, a very interesting book as well. So she's been doing a lot of privacy issue, but she talks about the RCEP provision or RCEP provisions with respect to privacy, with respect to data localization. That's quite interesting too, because most of those issues are usually ignored by US academics or EU academics. Also, that's wonderful. The thing I'll end on is about something that we did not get across in the last panel, which is actually very nicely done. Thank you for both of you guys for hosting the last panel. That was actually very interesting, especially for early career researchers. The thing that did not get a lot of mention or time on the panel is how you can market your research, right? It's not just about doing the best research you can or figuring out the faculty politics, but also how can you actually get known within the community, both within your own community as well as beyond, and also how to get cited, right? I think that's actually very important. So I think it'll be useful for people to start thinking about it. I think it's actually quite difficult. Those who are outside China or Asia, you have to play two games. You have to play the game with respect to what is expected within international publications and also international discourse, as well as what you care about internally. For those who are within China, you also play two games because you get, if you are very successful, you get a lot of invitation to do international conferences, to write on international journals in English. But then you also have to deal with the Chinese journals. You need to go to a lot of domestic conferences. So you're basically playing two games as well, right? Those are things I think that's quite challenging. I think the other thing is going to some of the discussion earlier on this panel is how can we actually get people to see the issue. So one thing I try to do is I have two book series with Elgar, and what I try to do is anybody who's finishing up a PhD, especially if I'm external, I'll try to encourage them to actually submit a proposal so that at least they get a book out of their thesis so that they can actually build on their career. And I think a lot of times we need to start thinking about it early. When Jack and I started Circ, we did not expect to actually still be here talking to you guys 22 years later, still talking to you guys. But I think that has paid off, right? We're actually very excited about that. Same thing about the book series I started in 2009. Now we have, the two series have 40 books in the series. So it's actually a very vibrant series where it includes a lot of different books on law and technology and society. And so AI is one of them, privacy is another topic, and we get into a lot of different issues, including relating to China, right? So I think those are the things we can think about in terms of how to reach out to others, how to frame the China issues so that they can understand it. One thing I want to leave at the very end of my remarks here is to get you to think about how to frame it so that people who are in the mainstream discourse or who are writing in international journals can actually understand the issue and don't consider that as either interesting or as niche, but actually see that is relevant to what they're doing. It requires a lot of trial and error, it requires a lot of skill, and it also requires you to actually know more enough people so that they actually think what you're writing is actually relevant to them and what's important to them. Some of them is just based on research, but other things based on the social aspects or how well you know people or how big is the network. And so that's quite important as well.